My name is Rachel, and I am 34 years old. For most of my adult life, I believed that family meant unconditional love, that blood was something sacred, and that the people who raised you would never truly turn their backs on you. I was wrong about all of that. This is the story of how my aunt and her husband tried to steal everything my grandmother had built over a lifetime and how my grandmother made sure they left with absolutely nothing. I need to start at the beginning, because without the beginning, none of the rest of it makes any sense. My parents died when I was 11 years old. It was a Sunday morning in late November, the kind of cold gray day where the sky looks like someone pressed a sheet of dirty gauze over the sun. They had gone out early to pick up groceries before the rest of the family arrived for Thanksgiving week preparations. A driver ran a red light going 40 miles over the speed limit. My parents never made it back home. I remember standing in the kitchen with my grandmother, who had come to stay for the holiday, when the police knocked on the door. I remember the sound my grandmother made when they told her. I have never forgotten that sound. It is the kind of thing that stays with you in the walls of your chest forever. After the funeral, after all the casseroles and the sympathy cards and the neighbors who stopped coming by, the question became what to do with me. My grandmother, my mother's mother, a woman named Frances who everyone called Fran, was 70 years old at the time and lived alone in a large house about 3 hours away. She wanted to take me in immediately. She was ready to rearrange her entire life for me without hesitation. But my aunt, my father's younger sister, stepped in and said that Grandma Fran was too old, that the drive was too far, that uprooting me from my school and my neighborhood on top of losing my parents would be too much for a child to handle. My aunt said all of this with great concern in her voice and her hand on my shoulder and her eyes wet with what I believed at the time were tears of genuine love. My aunt's name is Diane. She is 15 years older than me, which means she was in her early 40s when she took me in. She is tall, thin, and always perfectly dressed. She has the kind of smile that works very well in photographs and means very little in real life. Her husband, my uncle by marriage, is a man named Craig. Craig works in finance. Craig has soft hands and a loud laugh and has never, in all the years I have known him, asked me a single question about myself that was not somehow connected to money. I moved into their house in December. By February, I understood that I was not there because they loved me. I was there because my parents had a modest life insurance policy, and my aunt had positioned herself as my legal guardian before my grandmother could arrange an attorney. The monthly stipend for my care went directly to Diane and Craig. I never saw it. What I did see was that I was expected to babysit their 2 children, both younger than me, without complaint, that I was responsible for a significant portion of the household chores, and that I was referred to in Craig's presence as the arrangement when they did not realize I could hear them through the heating vent in my bedroom floor. I do not want to spend too much time in those years because they are painful, and I have worked very hard in therapy to stop giving them more space than they deserve. What matters is this: my grandmother was the only person who made any of it survivable. Grandma Fran called me every single evening at 7 o'clock. Not every week. Every single evening. She mailed me handwritten letters on her personalized stationery with the little bluebirds in the corner. She drove the 3 hours to attend every school play, every graduation ceremony, every important moment that my aunt and uncle were too busy to bother with. She was the reason I graduated high school, the reason I got through college on scholarships I worked furiously to earn, the reason I am a functioning adult today. When I was 22, I moved out of my aunt and uncle's house and into my first apartment in the city. Diane cried at the door, which I found interesting given that she had spent 11 years making it very clear I was a burden. I hugged her, told her I loved her, and drove away without looking back. For the next several years, my relationship with my aunt and uncle became what most dysfunctional family relationships become: cordial from a safe distance. Holiday dinners, birthday texts, nothing deeper than the surface. My grandmother, on the other hand, became my closest friend. I visited her as often as I could. I helped her with her garden and her bills and the endless small projects that come with owning an older home. I sat with her in the evenings and we watched old movies, and she told me stories about my mother as a little girl, and sometimes we both cried and sometimes we laughed so hard we forgot to be sad. She is 83 now and still sharp and still funny and still the person I trust most in this world. About 2 years ago, things started to shift. Grandma Fran mentioned during one of my visits that Diane had been calling more frequently, not just calling, visiting. Diane and Craig had started making the 3-hour drive on weekends, bringing flowers and groceries and an enthusiasm for my grandmother's company that had not previously existed in the 40 years I had been alive. I noted this. I did not say anything about it to my grandmother because she was happy to have the company and I did not want to be the kind of person who poisons every well they stand next to. But I noted it. Then, about 8 months ago, something happened that changed everything. I had come to spend the weekend with my grandmother, as I usually did every few weeks. I arrived on a Friday evening and we had dinner together and talked late into the night. On Saturday morning, I woke up early and went downstairs to make coffee. I could hear voices coming from the back porch. My grandmother had a small sitting area there with wicker furniture and wind chimes that sounded like rain. I recognized my grandmother's voice. The other voice took me a moment, and then my stomach dropped. It was Diane. I had not known she was coming. I stood in the kitchen with the coffee pot in my hand and listened, telling myself I was not eavesdropping, that I was simply a person standing in a kitchen holding a coffee pot who happened to be able to hear clearly through a screened door. What I heard made me set down the coffee pot very carefully so I would not drop it. Diane was talking about the house. Specifically, she was talking about what my grandmother planned to do with the house when she passed. She was asking in the gentle, circling way that people ask things when they want something badly but do not want to appear as though they want something badly. My grandmother, God bless her, was answering vaguely and politely the way she always did with people she did not fully trust. Then Diane said something that made the blood in my arms go cold. She said that she hoped my grandmother understood that Rachel, meaning me, was not in a position to manage a property of this size. That I had always been financially irresponsible. That I had a boyfriend my aunt and uncle did not approve of, which meant I had questionable judgment. That the responsible choice, the loving choice, the choice that my mother would have wanted, was for the house and the savings and the investment accounts to go to Diane and Craig, who had the experience and the stability to manage an estate properly. She said all of this in a warm, concerned voice, the same voice she had used when she convinced a room full of grieving adults to hand a traumatized 11-year-old over to her care. I stood in that kitchen for a very long time. I did not walk out onto the porch. I thought about it. Instead, I went back upstairs, sat on the edge of the guest bed, and called my grandmother's attorney, a kind older man named Gerald who had handled her affairs for decades and who I had met several times over the years at my grandmother's insistence. I left him a message. Then I texted my grandmother. I heard some of what Diane was saying on the porch. I'm not upset with you. I just want you to know I heard it. We can talk whenever you're ready. 20 minutes later, my grandmother knocked on my bedroom door. She came in and sat in the small armchair by the window and looked at me for a moment without saying anything. Then she said, "She has been saying things like this for months. I did not want to worry you." I told her she did not need to protect me. I told her I was 34 years old and I could handle difficult information. My grandmother looked at me with the expression she had used my entire life when she thought I was being brave about something that was actually hurting me. She said, "Rachel, I need to tell you something, and I need you to listen completely before you respond." I told her I was listening. She told me that 6 months ago, after Diane's visits had begun increasing in frequency and the conversations had begun drifting persistently toward finances, she had called Gerald and updated her will. She had updated it completely. Every account, the house, the investment portfolio she had built over 50 years, the small piece of land her own mother had left her, all of it, with the exception of a small and legally specific sum designated to prevent a will contest, was going to me. She had signed it. Gerald had it. It was done. I did not cry then. I wanted to, but I did not. I said, "Grandma, why didn't you tell me?" She said, "Because I needed to do it before anyone could talk me out of it or interfere. And because I wanted to watch Diane figure it out on her own." We looked at each other and despite everything, despite how heavy the morning had become, I laughed. My grandmother smiled the way she always smiles when she has done something she is quietly proud of. We went downstairs together. Diane was in the kitchen by then, making herself tea with the ease of someone who already considered herself at home. She looked up when we came in and smiled her photograph smile and said good morning to me with a warmth that was remarkable given what she had just been saying about my financial irresponsibility 20 minutes earlier. I said good morning. I poured my coffee. I sat down at the kitchen table and I let my grandmother lead. My grandmother sat down across from Diane and folded her hands on the table and said, very calmly, "Diane, I heard what you were saying to me on the porch this morning. I would like to talk about it." Diane's smile stayed on her face, but something behind her eyes shifted. She said, "Of course, Fran. I was just being honest about my concerns. I care about what happens to you and to this house." My grandmother said, "I know you do. I also know that what happens to this house has been the primary subject of your last 11 visits." She said it without raising her voice. She said it the way you state a weather forecast. Clear skies. 72 degrees. Diane looked at me. I looked back at her and said nothing. Diane said, "I understand why this might seem that way. But someone needs to have these conversations, Fran. Rachel means well, but she is not equipped." My grandmother interrupted her, which she almost never does. "Rachel is the most capable person I know. She has been since she was 11 years old. She had to be, because the people who were supposed to care for her treated her like a household employee." The color in Diane's face changed in a very specific way. It went from its normal tone to something slightly grayish and then to something pink. She said, "That is not fair. We gave Rachel everything. You gave Rachel a roof," my grandmother said. "There is a difference." I was gripping my coffee mug with both hands. I was not going to cry in front of Diane. I had made that decision years ago and I held to it. Diane looked at me again and I could see her recalibrating, the way she always had when a conversation was not going the direction she had planned. She shifted her tone from warm to wounded, which was her other setting. She said, "Rachel, I know things were not perfect, but we were doing our best. We took you in when no one else would." I said, "Grandma would have taken me in. On day one, she would have taken me in. You convinced a room full of people who were too devastated to think clearly that you were the better option. Then you collected the guardianship stipend for 7 years and called me the arrangement." Diane said, "I never called you that." I said, "Heating vents carry sound very well, Diane." There was a silence that lasted long enough that the refrigerator's hum became noticeable. Diane set down her tea. She looked at my grandmother and her voice changed again, going quiet and serious in a way she probably believed was persuasive. She said, "Fran, I have made mistakes. I know that, but I am still family. Craig and I are still family. We just want to make sure that your estate is handled responsibly. That is all this has ever been about." My grandmother reached across the table and picked up a small envelope that had been sitting near the fruit bowl, which I had not noticed before. She had clearly placed it there before coming downstairs. She held it out to Diane. Diane looked at it. She said, "What is this?" My grandmother said, "Open it." Diane opened it. She pulled out a single folded page and read it. I watched her face while she read. I watched the photograph smile disappear completely. I watched her eyes move back to the beginning and read it again. It was a letter from Gerald. A formal summary of the updated will, on his firm's letterhead, signed and dated 6 months prior. Diane set it down on the table. She said, "You cannot be serious." My grandmother said, "I am always serious about my finances, Diane. You know that about me. You're giving everything to Rachel." She said my name, the way you might say the name of a city you were not expecting to hear in a particular sentence. "I am giving everything to Rachel," my grandmother confirmed. "She is my daughter's daughter. She is the person I have watched struggle and grow and build a life with absolutely no help from the people who were supposed to provide it. She has earned it in ways that have nothing to do with money." Diane stood up. Her chair made a sound against the kitchen floor. She said, "This is because of this morning. You heard me on the porch and now you're punishing me." My grandmother said, "The will was signed 6 months ago. What you said on the porch this morning only confirmed what I already knew. Craig is going to hear about this. Craig is welcome to call Gerald," my grandmother said. "Gerald's number is at the bottom of the letter." Diane looked at me then, and for the first time in my life the look she gave me was not calculated. There was no strategy in it and no warmth and no photograph smile. It was just anger, plain and undisguised, and underneath the anger was something that looked almost like panic. She said, "You did this. You turned her against us." I said, "I found out about the will this morning, Diane. 20 minutes before you did." I said it quietly. I did not raise my voice. I had spent a long time imagining what I might say to my aunt in a moment like this, and I had imagined speeches and I had imagined accusations and I had imagined saying all the things that had accumulated over 23 years of being called an arrangement. But sitting at that kitchen table with my coffee and my grandmother beside me, I found that what I actually felt was something quieter than anger. It was more like clarity. I said, "You have spent 2 years driving 3 hours every few weekends trying to get into a will. You spent 11 years collecting money for raising me while I did the laundry and watched your kids and ate whatever was left after your family finished dinner. And when my grandmother wanted to take me in and actually love me, you stood in front of a room of grieving people and talked them out of it. So no. I did not turn her against you. You did that yourself. A long time ago." Diane picked up her purse from the counter. She picked up her car keys. She said, "This is not over." My grandmother said, very pleasantly, "Drive safe, Diane." We listened to her walk through the house and open the front door and close it behind her. We heard her car start in the driveway and pull away. And then the house was quiet except for the wind chimes on the back porch. My grandmother reached over and put her hand on mine. We sat like that for a while without speaking. I cried eventually. Not because I was sad exactly, but because of the weight of all the years of it, the accumulated weight of being 11 years old and standing in a kitchen and hearing the police knock on a door, and being 12 years old and understanding that the people who had taken you in were counting what you cost them, and being 17 and 18 and 20 and 22 and carrying all of it quietly because you did not want to be ungrateful, because you had been told that having a roof was the same as being loved. My grandmother held my hand and let me cry and did not tell me to stop or tell me it was all right or tell me that everything happened for a reason. She just stayed there, which is what she has always done. Staying there is the whole of what love actually is, I have decided. Not the speeches and not the photographs and not the concern voiced in warm, circling tones about someone else's estate. Just staying there. Craig called that evening. I was in the living room reading when my grandmother's phone rang and I heard her say his name. She was in the kitchen. I did not try to hear the conversation. I read my book and let my grandmother handle it because she had been handling things like Craig for 8 decades and she did not need my help. When she came back into the living room, she sat in her chair and picked up her crossword puzzle and said, "He wants to challenge the will." I said, "Can he?" She said, "Gerald says no. The sum I've left them is specifically calculated to make a contest inadvisable." She filled in a word on her crossword. "Craig also called you several things that I will not repeat." I said, "I can imagine." She said, "I told him that I had raised my daughters to have better vocabularies than that." I said, "I love you." She said, 7 letters, the habit of staying when things are difficult. She tapped her pen on the crossword grid. Loyalty. That fits. In the weeks that followed, Diane called my cell phone 11 times. I know because I counted them. Each call went to voicemail. The messages started out wounded and then turned accusatory and then turned plaintive and then stopped. Craig sent one email to my work address, which I found both invasive and impressive in its audacity. The email said that I had manipulated a vulnerable elderly woman and that he and Diane intended to pursue all available legal options. Gerald responded to that on my behalf and I did not hear from Craig again. My 2 cousins, Diane and Craig's children, the ones I had babysit for 7 years, texted me separately. The older one, who is 27 now and whom I have always quietly liked, said, "I heard what happened. For what it's worth, I always thought how they treated you was messed up. I'm sorry it took this long for someone to say it out loud." I texted back that I appreciated it and meant it. The younger one's text was angrier and I did not respond. That is the thing about families like this. They are not monolithic. There are people in them who know, who have always known, and who are waiting for someone to finally say the thing out loud so they can exhale. It has been almost 8 months now since that Saturday morning. I still visit my grandmother every few weeks. The house is quieter without the rotating frequency of Diane and Craig's concern. My grandmother's garden came in beautifully this past summer. We put up tomatoes and made jam from the peach tree in the backyard and sat on the porch in the evenings with the wind chimes making their rain sound, and we talked about my mother and we talked about the future, and we did not talk about Diane and Craig very much because they do not deserve the air time. I heard through a mutual relative that Diane and Craig's financial situation has become complicated. A business investment Craig made went poorly. They had apparently been counting on a significant inheritance to buffer a number of decisions they had made in recent years, decisions that now required buffering on their own. I did not feel as satisfied about this as I might have expected to. What I felt was something closer to tired. Tired that it had always been about money for them. Tired that my childhood had been a financial instrument. Tired in the particular way you get tired when you have been angry for a very long time and you finally allow yourself to stop. What I feel now, mostly, is grateful. Grateful in a way that has nothing to do with the will or the house or the investment accounts. Grateful that I have a grandmother who called me every single evening at 7 o'clock for 23 years. Grateful that she is here and that she is well, and that when I walk into her kitchen on a Friday evening and she looks up from whatever she is doing and says, "There you are," she means it the way it sounds. I have a framed photo on my desk at work. It is from my college graduation. I am in my cap and gown, and my grandmother is standing next to me, and she is smiling the way she smiles when she has done something she is quietly proud of. She is proud of me. She has always been proud of me. She told me once that watching me grow up was the most meaningful thing she had witnessed in her long and full life. And she said it matter-of-factly, the way she says true things, without decoration. I know that what my aunt and uncle did to me was wrong. I know it clearly and without flinching now, in a way that took a very long time and a great deal of therapy to arrive at. But I also know that the wrong they did exists in the same life that contains every phone call at 7 o'clock, every letter with the bluebirds in the corner, every Saturday morning in a garden, every evening on a wicker porch with wind chimes. And somehow, despite all of it, or maybe because of all of it, I have ended up somewhere I would not trade. I have ended up here. With the person who has always stayed. There is no inheritance in the world worth more than that.